Azizat's name echoed softly in the hearts of everyone in her Abadan neighborhood, and when her sudden death was announced, the shock spread like wildfire. She was only 23, a girl whose life had been defined by her devotion to prayer, her soft recitations of the Qur'an, and her gentle way of gathering children beneath the large mango tree to teach them the verses she loved. Her parents, poor but proud, always said she was their crown jewel, the one who brought honor to their name. She was not one for the market's gossip or the shallow laughter of girls her age. Instead, she preferred the cool silence of dawn, the rhythm of her tasbih beads sliding between her fingers, and the satisfaction of helping a child memorize Surat al-Fatiha correctly. People used to smile when she passed, because she carried an aura of calm that made everyone feel that she was different, chosen in some way. That was why the news of her sudden collapse, followed by her death after only 3 days of fever, struck like a heavy storm on an unsuspecting village. Her mother screamed until her voice cracked, her father sank into silence, and children who used to crowd around her legs cried uncontrollably. Everyone asked the same question: why would God take such a righteous soul so early? Yet no one had answers. The day of her janazah arrived, and it was as if the entire district had emptied into the courtyard. Men lined up in white, women veiled in black and colorful hijabs, children pressed against their mothers. The imam's voice carried through the air with supplication, every phrase rising into the sky as people said Ameen with trembling lips. The body, wrapped neatly in white, was light as it was lifted by the men who carried her toward the graveyard. Her mother, clutching her scarf, whispered verses under her breath, begging God to make the soil gentle and the questioning angels merciful. Everyone expected this to be the peaceful end of a righteous life, a moment that would remind them all of their own mortality. But as the ropes lowered her body into the grave, something shifted beneath the ground. At first, it was a subtle vibration like distant thunder. Then, suddenly, the soil cracked, splitting as though rejecting what was being placed within it. Black snakes as thick as wrists slithered out violently, their tongues hissing. Scorpions with claws raised scattered from the opening. The men holding the ropes screamed and stumbled back, dropping the body halfway in the grave. Women shrieked, children ran, and chaos overtook the air. The imam froze, Quran verses still on his lips, as everyone watched in terror. This was not what anyone expected. For a moment, disbelief gripped them. Azizat, the pious teacher, the girl of the Quran, was being rejected by the very earth. The graveyard, once a place of solemn silence, became a ground of confusion and fear. Men argued loudly, some insisting it was sorcery, others shouting it was a test from Allah. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, while some old men whispered that they had never seen such a sign in their entire lives. The imam, visibly shaken, tried to calm the crowd, raising his trembling hand as he commanded the men to recite loudly from the Quran. Surat al-Yasin echoed through the air, voices blending in a desperate chorus, as if the sound of the holy verses would silence the serpents and calm the cracked earth. Yet when the men tried again, lowering her body back into the grave, the ground convulsed. This time, the shovels flew from their hands as if thrown by unseen forces, and the body rolled back onto the ground, still wrapped in its white cloth. The snakes surged upward again, their scales glistening in the harsh afternoon sun, their hisses piercing the air. The women screamed louder, some fainting on the spot. Her mother collapsed in grief, calling her daughter's name, while her father fell to his knees, clutching his beard with both hands as he sobbed. "Ya Allah, what sin did she commit to deserve this? Was she not better than all of us? Was she not a lover of your words?" No one dared to move close to the grave again. Panic and incomprehension spread like wildfire through the community. Azizat's reputation had been untarnished. Everyone knew her as the girl who prayed 5 times daily, fasted beyond Ramadan, and lived her life teaching others to love the Quran. The very idea that the soil could reject her body was something no one could explain. Some elders muttered that it must be black magic, jealousy from an unseen enemy, who cursed her even in death. Others whispered that perhaps she had harbored sins unknown to them all, sins that only God could judge. Younger men, terrified by the sight, ran home swearing they would never miss a prayer again. Children clung to their mothers, their eyes wide with fear, while women questioned one another. If even Azizat is rejected, what about us? The imam ordered the body to be taken aside, laid carefully under the shade of a tree while discussions continued. For hours, the community argued, frightened and broken, while the body of the girl they once praised as their jewel lay untouched, her burial denied, her grave refusing her. As the sun slid lower in the sky, The air around the graveyard grew tense with a kind of fear nobody could name. The imam gathered the strongest men of the community and urged them to try once again. He insisted it was their duty as Muslims to bury the dead, no matter what trials appeared. With hearts trembling, they lifted Azizat's body once more, whispering supplications beneath their breaths. Her father stood close, tears streaking his face, while her mother had to be held upright by two women who fanned her and whispered words of comfort she did not hear. The men moved carefully, lowering the shrouded body again into the grave, their voices rising in unison with recitations. But the moment the white cloth touched the soil, the earth heaved upward like a chest refusing to inhale. Sand spewed into the air, and a shriek rose from those who witnessed it. The men dropped the body once again as the ground cracked open wider, spewing forth more snakes, their scales shining like polished ebony in the waning light. Their tongues flickered like flames, and they slithered over one another with a fury that made even the bravest men leap back. Scorpions scuttled out by the dozens, their tails arched and stingers glowing faintly, as if charged with fire. The ground itself seemed alive, rejecting her with a force that none could explain. For the third time the attempt failed. This time, the panic spread uncontrollably. Some men fled, muttering curses under their breath as they swore they would not risk their lives again. Women pulled their children away, their wails piercing the thick evening air. Neighbors shouted at each other, blaming one another, pointing fingers at imaginary enemies. "It is witchcraft," cried one old woman, beating her chest. Someone cursed her family. Another spat into the dust, claiming Azizat must have hidden sins that no one had known. The imam himself sank down, his face pale, his Qur'an trembling in his hands as he recited verse after verse, his voice breaking between sobs. The fear was no longer just about Azizat's burial, it was about what it meant for everyone else. If the earth could reject the most pious among them, what hope did they, sinners with obvious faults, have when their own time came? The graveyard became a place of hysteria. The body, still wrapped in white, lay between the living and the dead, a symbol of confusion too heavy for anyone to understand. The question on every tongue was the same: what sin did Azizat commit, or what curse has been placed upon her, for the soil to reject her like this? That night, as the body remained guarded under the watch of her grieving family, whispers grew thicker than the harmattan dust. Small clusters of neighbors sat in corners, talking in hushed voices, piecing together fragments of Azizat's life they had noticed but never questioned. An elderly woman claimed she once saw Azizat returning late at night with swollen eyes, as if she had been weeping. Another insisted she had heard Azizat pleading in whispers in the mosque long after everyone else had left, her words too low to understand but her tone desperate. Men debated among themselves, some convinced that she was the victim of jealous rivals who envied her knowledge of the Qur'an, others suggesting that perhaps her piety had been a mask, hiding sins so great that only Allah knew. Her friends defended her memory fiercely, reminding the doubters that she had spent her entire life in devotion, teaching their children, guiding women in prayer, and sacrificing her youth for service. Yet their voices were drowned in the rising tide of suspicion, because nothing in the community's memory could explain what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Her mother, meanwhile, sat broken in her home, clutching her scarf and rocking herself back and forth. She refused to believe the rumors, crying out again and again that her daughter had been pure, that she had lived a life more righteous than even the imam himself. But even her husband, silent and shattered, could not push aside the words of the old cleric who had whispered to him before leaving the graveyard. Sometimes a heart carries secrets no one else knows. Sometimes what you see in public is not the same as what lies in the silence of the night. Those words burned into his mind, though he hated himself for even entertaining them. Could it be possible that his Azizat, his daughter of prayer, had lived with a hidden darkness? Or was the whole village falling into fitna, chasing shadows because they could not understand Allah's test? He watched the flickering lantern light as neighbors continued their hushed debates outside, their whispers reaching him like the hiss of snakes in the night, and his heart grew heavier. What was buried inside his daughter's life that the soil itself seemed unwilling to accept? The house of Azizat's parents was filled with wailing that could be heard from the end of the street. Women gathered around her mother, holding her arms as she cried uncontrollably, her voice hoarse from screaming her daughter's name. "She was pure! She was pure!" she repeated, beating her chest as if her heart itself wanted to escape. Memories flooded her mind in painful flashes. Azizat as a little girl, clutching her first Qur'an and proudly reciting to her father. Azizat refusing to attend parties with other girls her age because she preferred the mosque. Azizat sitting by her side late at night, her soft voice whispering verses that lulled her siblings to sleep. Her mother could not reconcile those images with the horror at the graveyard. To her, the world had gone mad. People outside whispered their poison, suggesting her daughter had sins, but she silenced them with her screams, declaring before Allah that Azizat's life had been nothing but light. Yet the memory of that cracked earth and those writhing snakes gnawed at her mind, whispering questions she didn't want to answer. Her father sat in silence, broken. He remembered too many times when he had seen his daughter return home late from teaching, her eyes red as though she had been crying. He never asked because he trusted her strength, but now those images clawed at his memory like sharp nails. He wished he had asked, wished he had forced her to share whatever pain she had hidden. The words of the Imam echoed in his ears. Sometimes the heart carries secrets. Could it be that she had carried a burden none of them knew? The mother, still sobbing, turned to her husband with fierce eyes. "Tell them to stop. Tell them not to speak against her." "Our daughter was innocent," she shouted. He wanted to believe her fully, but doubt seeped in like water through a cracked roof. His heart was torn between his faith in her piety and the terror of what they had all witnessed. Outside, the night carried the sound of neighbors still murmuring, voices rising and falling with rumors. Inside, the grief of a mother who refused to believe anything but her daughter's innocence swallowed the air whole. The next morning, the clerics gathered at the graveyard once more. Determined to restore dignity to the burial, they arrived with Qur'ans in hand, their voices stern and commanding. The Imam ordered the crowd to stay back while he and the other scholars surrounded the open grave. They began to recite loudly, their voices weaving through the verses of Surat al-Baqarah, hoping to drive away whatever evil forces had taken hold of the soil. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of their chanting, as if the ground itself listened. Men carried Azizat's body once more, sweat pouring down their faces as they placed her carefully at the edge of the grave. All eyes watched in silence, breaths held, hearts pounding. For a brief moment, it seemed the prayers were working. The soil was still, the snakes nowhere in sight. But just as they lowered her shrouded form into the grave, the ground erupted violently, louder than before. The earth cracked open with a roar, spitting sand into the faces of those closest. A hiss unlike anything human ears had ever heard filled the graveyard, and black serpents poured out in terrifying numbers, writhing over one another, tongues flicking with rage. The clerics themselves stumbled back, their Qur'ans nearly slipping from their hands. The scorpions returned too, glowing faintly under the morning sun, their tails raised in defiance. The body rolled out again, lying untouched on the ground, as though an invisible hand had pushed it away. The crowd panicked, screams tearing through the air once more. Mothers clutched their children tightly, some fainted at the sight, while men shook their heads in disbelief. The Imam's voice cracked as he cried out supplications, but even his words trembled with fear. At that moment, one of the oldest elders raised his hand and shouted, "Stop! Stop this madness! The earth will not take her until the truth is revealed." His words silenced the chaos for a brief second. The people turned to him, confused, fearful, desperate. He spoke again, his voice heavy with authority. "This is not the doing of snakes or scorpions alone. This is a sign. A truth buried with her must come out, or she will not rest." The words spread like fire, and a new fear settled in the people's hearts. If this was true, then what truth was so heavy that even the grave refused to hold it? The clerics, defeated by the terrifying scene at the graveyard, ordered that Azizat's body be taken back to her home until a solution could be found. The white shroud was carried with trembling hands, laid in the small sitting room where lantern light flickered against the walls. Her mother refused to leave her side, her fingers clutching the edge of the cloth as she whispered prayers over and over. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the house grew strange. The air became heavy, thick with unease. The children whispered of hearing hisses in the corners of the room, even though no snake was in sight. The wooden windows rattled though the wind outside was still. At one point, her younger brother swore he saw shadows slithering along the wall, only to vanish when the lantern was lifted. Fear gripped the family, and no one slept. Every sound, the creak of the roof, the cry of a night bird, the rustle of the breeze, felt like a sign of something lurking. Her siblings clung to their mother, their wide eyes refusing to close. Her father sat on a stool, staring blankly at the body, his mind a battlefield of faith and dread. He could not shake the feeling that something in his daughter's life had gone unseen, something that now cried out from the silence of her shrouded form. Neighbors gathered outside the compound, afraid to enter, but unwilling to leave the family alone in their torment. From time to time, faint whispers rose in the night air, Qur'an verses recited by those who kept vigil outside, asking Allah to bring peace to a soul that had brought so much light in life. Yet inside the home, peace was far from reach. The family sat in a storm of grief and fear, the presence of the body that the earth itself had rejected pressing on their hearts like a weight too heavy to bear. By dawn, Azizat's father could no longer remain still. The sleepless night had left him trembling with exhaustion, but his heart burned with determination. If the soil would not accept his daughter, then he needed to know why. He rose quietly, leaving his wife sobbing beside the body, and stepped into the cool morning air. He walked from house to house, knocking on the doors of those who had known his daughter closely. Some were surprised, some hesitant, but one by one, they told him fragments of what they had seen. A neighbor spoke of nights when Azizat lingered in the mosque long after others had left, her sobs echoing softly through the empty space. Another recalled seeing her sitting by the riverbank, whispering to herself, tears rolling down her cheeks as though she carried a weight too heavy to share. Her father listened, his chest tightening with each confession, his mind piecing together the fragments of a puzzle he did not yet understand. When he returned home, his face was lined with worry. He sat quietly, replaying the words in his mind. Why had she cried so much in secret? What burden had she carried? As if on cue, one of the older women from the neighborhood came to him. She lowered her voice and said, I once heard your daughter begging Allah to forgive her. Her voice shook as if she feared a sin none of us could see. But when I asked her later if she was all right, she smiled and said she was fine. The man's heart sank. He remembered the times he had seen her red eyes after teaching children. He remembered how she would sometimes sit silently at dinner, lost in thought, her hands trembling over her food. He had thought it was just the strain of her work. Now he realized there had been something deeper, something she had hidden from them all. Exhausted from his search for answers, Azizat's father returned home that evening with a resolve that weighed heavier than stone. The whispers of neighbors gnawed at him, the memory of their trembling voices telling of Azizat's secret tears replaying in his mind. He stepped into her small room, a place she had cherished, and for the first time since her death he looked around with searching eyes. Her prayer mat was still neatly folded in the corner, her Qur'an resting atop it. The shelves held the notebooks of children she had taught, each page filled with verses in careful handwriting. Everything spoke of devotion and discipline. Yet something felt incomplete, as though her room hid a silence that was louder than sound. He began to search, lifting mats, moving books, opening drawers. At first he found nothing, only the scent of his daughter still clinging to her scarf. But then, beneath her prayer mat, tucked deep into the corner, he discovered a small diary, worn at the edges as though handled often in secret. With trembling hands he opened it. The first pages were filled with Qur'an verses and personal reflections on faith, her handwriting neat and steady. But as he turned further, his heart began to pound. There, in words carved with trembling strokes, she revealed her torment. She wrote of a man she could not name aloud, a respected elder in the community who had betrayed her trust. He had threatened her, blackmailed her, and stained her purity with fear. She wrote of nights spent in tears, begging Allah for forgiveness, not because she had willingly sinned, but because she felt tainted by the evil forced upon her. Her words were desperate, filled with shame she did not deserve, but her silence had been her shield. She feared no one would believe her if she spoke. She feared she would bring dishonor to her family, and so she bore the weight alone. Her father's hands shook violently as the diary slipped from his grip and fell to the floor. His chest heaved with sobs as realization crashed over him like a violent tide. His daughter's grave rejection was not a punishment for secret rebellion, but the echo of injustice left unspoken. She had carried pain that the world never saw, and now even in death, her silence demanded to be heard. The next morning, Azizat's father gathered the courage to share what he had found. With the diary clutched in his trembling hands, he walked to the mosque where the elders had assembled to discuss the next attempt at burial. His voice broke as he read aloud the words written by his daughter. Gasps filled the air, some men lowering their heads in shame, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The name she hinted at in the diary became clear when he read the descriptions. The elder she spoke of was none other than a trusted Qur'an teacher in the community, a man who had taught many of their children and led prayers on countless occasions. The crowd stirred with unrest, some refusing to believe such a man could commit such acts, others remembering subtle signs they had ignored. Women wept, clutching their scarves tighter, while men muttered angrily, their faith in the elder shattered. The cleric himself, when confronted, denied it furiously, pounding his chest and shouting that it was a lie. His words rang through the mosque, but for the first time, they did not carry conviction. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, voices rising like a storm as people recalled their daughter's fearful glances, the times they had dismissed as nothing. By the time the father finished reading, the community was divided. Some demanded the elder confess and repent, others insisted it was a slander against his reputation. The imam's face was pale with shock, his voice trembling as he tried to calm the crowd. But it was too late. The revelation had cracked something in the village, leaving everyone unsettled. Mothers clutched their daughters closer, their hearts trembling with fear of what might have been hidden all along. Fathers shifted uncomfortably, realizing the trust they had placed in a man who had perhaps been unworthy of it. The earth's rejection of Azizat's body no longer seemed like a random curse. It became, in the eyes of many, a sign, a message that truth, no matter how long it is buried, cannot remain hidden forever. Yet the man accused stood tall, denying every word, his eyes burning with rage and defiance. And in that moment, the weight of Azizat's suffering spread through the community like poison, leaving them to face a question more terrifying than snakes or scorpions. How many secrets had been buried among them, and how many others would remain silent in the face of fear? The air in the mosque had barely settled from the storm of accusations when a trembling voice rose from the crowd. It was a young girl, no older than 16, her hijab pulled low over her face, her hands clutching her mother's arm as she spoke. At first her words were broken, her tears drowning them, but soon her courage hardened, and she confessed what many had long suspected but never dared to utter aloud. She too had been a victim of the same respected elder. She told of nights when he lured her under the guise of teaching, of how he cornered her with words that poisoned her innocence, of how she had been too afraid to tell anyone because of his standing in the community. The crowd fell silent, the sound of her sobs the only thing filling the room. Then, as though a dam had broken, another voice rose, this time from an older woman who claimed she had always suspected his behavior, but had been too frightened to speak. The room was thick with horror. The elder, faced with these words, denied everything even more furiously. He shouted that it was a plot to ruin him, that jealous men were using young girls to destroy his name. His face flushed with anger, his beard trembling as he swore by Allah that he was innocent. But the more he protested, the more eyes turned away from him. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers exchanged uneasy glances, and young men who had once respected him spat into the dust. The revelation shook the foundations of their trust. What had begun as whispers around Azizat's grave had now become a roar that could not be silenced. Azizat's diary had spoken, and now her silence was joined by living voices. The community trembled, their faith shaken not in Allah but in the men they had chosen to trust. Fear mingled with rage, for if the grave could expose one man's hidden darkness, who else among them carried secrets waiting to be revealed? Back in the house, Azizat's mother sat surrounded by women who tried to console her, but her grief only deepened. Every word of the diary echoed in her ears, every confession of the other girls stabbed at her heart like knives. She remembered nights when her daughter had crept into her bed silently, pressing her face into her mother's shoulder as though seeking comfort she could not ask for. She remembered times when Azizat's voice had cracked while reciting Qur'an, her tears wetting the pages, and how she had brushed it aside, thinking her daughter was simply moved by devotion. Now she realized those tears had carried a heavier burden. She had seen her daughter smile through pain, seen her laugh while hiding torment, and never once had she pressed her to speak. The realization crushed her. She had failed to protect the child she loved most. She wailed loudly, her voice carrying through the compound. "Why didn't you tell me, my daughter? Why didn't you trust me with your pain?" Her cries broke the hearts of those who heard, for they knew the answer. In a world where voices of girls were too often silenced, Azizat had chosen silence to protect her family's honor. And now, that silence had turned into a punishment in the grave, not because she was guilty but because the injustice had been buried with her. Her father stood in the doorway, his face lined with shame and sorrow, unable to meet his wife's eyes. He too had failed, trusting too blindly in the elder, ignoring the signs of his daughter's broken spirit. The family sat in grief heavier than death, mourning not just Azizat's loss but the pain she had carried alone. Her mother pressed her forehead to the shroud, her tears soaking it, whispering again and again, "You were innocent. Allah knows you were innocent." Yet even as she said it, She wondered if Allah's mercy could still embrace a child whose grave had turned into a battlefield between hidden truth and divine justice. The revelations had shaken the entire community. For 2 days, Azizat's body remained in her parents' home, untouched by the soil that rejected her. Fear kept people at a distance, yet guilt and sorrow drove them back to her side. On the 3rd night, the Imam and a group of respected clerics gathered once more, determined to seek Allah's mercy. They declared that this time, they would not attempt burial without first cleansing the community of its silence. The mosque bell rang out across the district, summoning men, women, and children. People came in their numbers, carrying Qur'ans, prayer beads, and trembling hearts. The night sky was heavy with clouds, and the air felt still, as though even the heavens were waiting. The clerics began with long recitations from Surat al-Yasin, their voices weaving through the night like a thread stitching broken fabric. People cried openly as they prayed, their voices blending into a river of sorrow and supplication. The Imam fell to his knees, his voice breaking as he begged Allah to forgive Azizat, to see her suffering as endurance, and to cleanse her grave of torment. Women raised their hands, sobbing as they prayed for their daughters, vowing never again to dismiss the silent tears of a child. Men bowed their heads, ashamed of the trust they had misplaced, seeking forgiveness for their negligence. As the hours passed, the community was transformed, united in grief and repentance. They were no longer just burying Azizat, they were burying their silence, their failure, and their blindness to injustice. By dawn, the air was thick with exhaustion and tears, but also with a strange peace. The snakes had not appeared all night, and the scorpions had not been heard. It was as if the earth itself was listening, waiting for the final act of surrender. At sunrise, the men carried Azizat's body once more, their steps slow and heavy, but this time with a hope that had been absent before. The women followed, whispering du'as, while children clutched their mothers' hands in silence. The grave had been cleansed, the soil freshly turned, as though prepared for reconciliation. The Imam stood at its edge, his hands raised high as he called upon Allah's mercy one final time. Then, with trembling breaths, the men lowered her body gently into the earth. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the ground to shudder, for snakes to appear, for terror to rise again. But nothing happened. The soil received her quietly, as if embracing her at last. The ropes slipped free, and the sand fell softly over the white shroud, covering her inch by inch until she was gone from sight. A silence settled over the graveyard, not of fear but of awe. Tears flowed freely, but they were different now. Tears of relief, of closure, of knowing that the earth had finally taken her in. Her mother collapsed onto the ground, kissing the soil above her daughter, sobbing in gratitude. Her father knelt beside her, whispering prayers through his tears. The people who had doubted, who had whispered of hidden sins, now lowered their heads in shame. The Imam turned to them with a heavy voice and said, "Let this be a lesson. The grave does not only judge the dead, it judges the living who failed them." Azizat was pure, but her silence cried out louder than her voice. And Allah, in His wisdom, made sure we heard it. The crowd murmured in agreement, their hearts heavy with the truth. The earth had accepted her, but the memory of what they had witnessed would never leave them. For the rest of their lives, whenever they stood at a grave, they would remember the girl who had been rejected until her pain was revealed. In the days that followed Azizat's burial, the community lived in a state of quiet reflection. The graveyard no longer echoed with screams, but with soft footsteps of neighbors, who came often to recite Qur'an over her resting place. Her grave, once a site of horror, became a place of lessons. Mothers brought their daughters there, whispering that silence in the face of injustice was too heavy a burden for one heart to carry. Fathers stood before the mound of soil, their eyes wet with shame, vowing never again to dismiss the subtle cries of their children. The air around the compound seemed changed, as though Azizat's story had woven itself into the very wind. Her mother spent her days near the grave, speaking to her daughter through her tears, promising that her pain had not been in vain. Her father sat quietly by her side, the diary always within reach, a reminder that truth buried in secrecy can destroy even the most pious soul's peace. The elder who had been accused never walked the streets the same way again. Whispers followed him wherever he went, his denials no longer strong enough to cover the cracks in his reputation. Families pulled their children from his reach, and men who once prayed behind him now refused to let him lead. Though no formal judgment came from a court or authority, the community itself delivered its verdict in silence, turning their backs on him. Yet beyond his disgrace, it was Azizat's memory that lingered most. She had been the light of the Qur'an in their midst, the teacher of children, the daughter of prayer. And yet, her torment had gone unseen. Her grave rejection had forced them all to confront the weight of silence, the danger of ignoring tears, and the need for truth no matter how painful. From that day onward, whenever someone in the community saw a child cry quietly, they leaned closer, they asked, they listened. For Azizat's story had taught them that even the most pious can carry wounds, and that sometimes Allah allows the earth itself to speak when humans refuse to. And so, though she was gone, her life and her death became a lesson that no one could forget, a reminder that justice begins not in the grave, but in the way we care for the living. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and put on post notifications.